Singapore wants to build a new island to power the next 50 years. But will it actually control that power? The sunshine is coming from Malaysia, and one day the baseload might come from a nuclear reactor in Indonesia. Act 1, the last reef before the Reclamation Lin. Our opening chapter takes us to the southern waters of Singapore, where a major infrastructure vision collides directly with living history. The government has put forward an ambitious proposal that could eventually merge 3 southern islands into a unified landmass. Yet in the exact open waters marked for this massive transformation, an elderly fisherman still sets his traditional traps every single morning, working the fragile marine corridors that remain. Hamzah Mohammed is 71 years old, and most mornings find him working the open sea between 3 specific islands Singapore has proposed to merge. He was born on Pulau Sudong during an era when it was an active fishing settlement rather than a military live-firing zone. Today, regulations bar him from stepping foot on his birthplace. He cannot land on Bukom either, which has operated as an industrial oil refinery for decades, nor on Semakau, which serves as the country's sole operational landfill. What Hamzah can still do is practice the generational craft passed down through his family, weaving boo-boo wire traps used widely across the Malay world. He sets these woven traps among the live reefs flanking all 3 offshore islands, maintaining a traditional livelihood built entirely upon the open waters in between. That exact marine space between the islands is precisely what the government recently suggested filling in to create new land. At the National Day rally, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong outlined a long-term study to merge Semakau, Bukom and Pulau Sudong, along with nearby islets, into a single platform south of Jurong Island, meant to support advanced manufacturing and power infrastructure for the next 50 years. Sudong is not waiting for that study to conclude. Since April, Singapore's Ministry of Defence has been extending its military runway there for a new fleet of jets, a separate project already reshaping Hamzah's birthplace years before Wong's island is even decided. The official framing for the bigger plan still mirrors Jurong Island's creation 3 decades ago, though that original transformation came with a profound human cost on indigenous waters. Act 2. What Jurong Island buried to become a hub. To understand what is at stake south of Jurong, we have to look back at how Singapore engineered its industrial core in the first place. The modern petrochemical capital did not exist on older maritime charts. Decades of heavy coastal engineering erased an entire network of distinct islands and traditional communities, laying the groundwork for an industrial transformation that modern planning now seeks to replicate. Jurong Island was originally 7 separate landmasses: Ayer Merbau, Ayer Cawan, Sakra, Bakau, Soraya, Merlimau, and Pesek, surrounded by smaller rocky islets. Decades of relentless sand filling fused these distinct geographies into a singular, highly integrated platform. Today, it stands as one of the densest refining and chemical processing clusters on the globe, anchoring national energy processing for half a century. The economic logic behind merging the original 7 islands was undeniably compelling. Individually, the small landmasses generated minimal industrial output, but combined, they provided a massive platform for long-term growth. Yet these waters were never empty space. They were home to established Orang Laut, Bugis and Malay communities who sustained themselves through boat building, reef navigation, and generational artisanal fishing. Pulau Seking was the final traditional stilt house kampung surviving in Singapore's southern waters. Between the 1970s and 1990s, authorities relocated its residents to mainland public housing estates to clear the way for Bukom's expanding petrochemical facilities and the Semakau offshore landfill. With that planned relocation, the tangible daily life and physical footprint of the community disappeared from the southern seascape. Firdaus Sani leads Orang Laut SG, a non-profit initiative dedicated to recording and preserving this displaced coastal heritage. His own grandmother lived on Semakau prior to its conversion into a municipal landfill. He highlights that further engineering around the southern islands risks wiping out the final physical traces of these seafaring communities. Hamzah's active boo-boo fishing is not a museum piece. It is living history practiced on the very reefs facing reclamation. Act 3. The Sun Johor sails north. While Singapore explores long-term reclamation studies at home, cross-border energy flows are already moving forward rapidly right next door. Malaysia is taking decisive steps to convert its vast land resources into exportable clean power. This shift establishes a major cross-border commercial dynamic that links Singapore's growing domestic demand directly to Johor's expanding utility infrastructure. On 7 August 2026, the Energy Market Authority granted conditional approval for 900 megawatts of electricity imports from Peninsular Malaysia. The import allocation is divided across 2 major ventures located in the state of Johor. Rather than waiting for Singapore's multi-decade domestic reclamation timeline to unfold, regional developers moved quickly to lock in large-scale renewable generation. Under the first approved project, Sembcorp Utilities will supply 300 megawatts sourced from a planned 2.2 gigawatt peak floating solar farm on the Linggiu Reservoir. Developed in partnership with Johor state-owned enterprise KPRJ Environment, the expansive water surface array will integrate battery energy storage to supply reliable cross-border power directly into Singapore's grid. The larger allocation of 600 megawatts belongs to Southern Solar Alliance, a subsidiary of Malaysian clean energy firm Ditrolic Energy. This project forms the initial phase of the Southern Johor Renewable Energy Corridor, a 15-year undertaking valued at $6 billion. The regional project is backed by Johor's state investment vehicle Permodalan Darul Tazim, alongside funding support from the World Bank's International Finance Corporation. Tham Chi On, Group Chief Executive of Ditrolic, noted that the regulatory milestone proves the technical scale and commercial robustness of cross-border imports. Meanwhile, Permodalan Darul Tazim Chief Executive Datuk Ramli Rahman emphasized that Johor intends to establish itself as a global-scale renewable energy hub in its own right, leveraging green power to anchor investments within the Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone. A remarkable historical irony sits inside this project at Linggiu Reservoir. Singapore's Public Utilities Board originally built Linggiu to regulate the Johor River under the 1962 Water Agreement that runs through 2061, securing rights to draw up to 250 million gallons of raw water daily. The reservoir experienced severe droughts twice over the past decade, dropping to 20% capacity in 2016. Now, Singapore plans to import solar electricity floated on the very reservoir it relies upon for drinking water. Act 4. 6 years between a decision and a reactor. Malaysia is selling Singapore sunshine. Indonesia is choosing a completely different path. It is betting on nuclear power instead and keeping nearly all of it at home. We are witnessing two entirely different national blueprints for the regional energy transition. Malaysia is aggressively scaling up export-oriented solar developments tied to international off-takers. Indonesia, by contrast, has decided against power exports, prioritizing domestic nuclear baseload to anchor its own internal economic expansion. Yet both models are meant to connect into one shared system, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Power Grid, known simply as the ASEAN Power Grid. Under President Prabowo Subianto, Indonesia has accelerated its nuclear deployment, aiming for first grid connection between 2032 and 2034, with two initial 250 megawatt units in West Kalimantan and Sumatra. State utility PLN plans for 7 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2040 and 44 gigawatts by 2060. Singapore, meanwhile, will only begin formal readiness assessments with the International Atomic Energy Agency in 2027 without any policy commitment to build. Here is the optimistic version. Indonesia's nuclear power could eventually feed into the very same grid carrying Malaysian solar into Singapore. Spread the risk and the generation across 3 countries. And that is exactly what the ASEAN power grid was built to do. The adverse reality is generating intense local friction on the ground in West Kalimantan. Jakarta's preferred site is Pulau Semakau in Bengkayang Regency, designated under a 2025 ministerial decree due to its lower required safety buffer as an uninhabited island. Hendrikus Adam of environmental organization Alhe Kalimantan Barat disputes this official status, insisting the surrounding waters are vital fishing territory. Local coordinator Abid Nibras Trilanang has organized community protests across Pontianak and Jakarta, warning that reactor thermal cooling could severely disrupt critical coastal fisheries. If Indonesia pushes its nuclear program forward past local opposition, the wider region secures firm baseload capacity long before Singapore concludes its own domestic assessments. But that rapid acceleration means environmental disruption falls directly upon artisanal fishing communities who were never consulted about hosting the plant. It creates an unmistakable regional parallel to the displacement experienced by coastal families across Singapore's southern islands. Act 5. Who owns Southeast Asia's next 50 years? Prime Minister Wong described the new Southern Land Reclamation as a multi-decade bet comparable to the original engineering of Jurong Island. But that historic transition operated under complete territorial sovereignty. The next half-century of regional energy security operates under entirely different constraints. Jurong Island gave Singapore full control because Singapore built the entire industrial base on ground it reclaimed under its own authority. The next 50 years cannot replicate that. This time, Singapore shares the timeline with neighbors selling power on 15-year contracts and building reactors on far longer ones. And no amount of sand can speed that up. Longset ultimately controls how much generated power remains in Johor and how much is transmitted across the Johor Strait. Indonesia alone determines whether Pulau Semakau becomes a nuclear baseload hub or remains a coastal fishing ground, regardless of what Singapore's 2027 International Readiness Assessment concludes. Coastal reclamation secured sovereignty for the last energy transition, but it cannot buy total independence for the next. Hamza remains out on the reef most mornings, laying his woven wire traps across waters whose ultimate fate is being negotiated across 3 separate capitals without his input. Whether that open channel becomes an expanded industrial platform, a high-voltage cable landing site, or an entirely new infrastructure corridor, he will discover the outcome exactly as he did with Bukom and Sudong, long after the final decision has already been signed. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.